On March 15, 2023, while the American public was distracted by domestic political theater, the global financial order was quietly executed. In Riyadh, a handshake took place that effectively nullified the single most important economic contract of the last 50 years. Saudi Arabia officially announced it would accept Chinese yuan for oil sales. This was not a trade deal. It was a calculated breach of the 1974 monopoly that forced the world to buy American debt to survive. The petrodollar didn't just stumble, it died. Most mainstream economists dismissed this as a minor geopolitical pivot. They are wrong. This event marked the official entry into stage 6 of a mathematical 8-stage collapse pattern that has destroyed every reserve currency in the last 5 centuries. It killed the Portuguese real in the 1600s. It dismantled the Dutch guilder in the 1700s. No empire collapses from war first. They collapse from currency failure. The United States is not an exception to this rule. We are simply the next data point following the exact same blueprint. Stage by stage, crisis by crisis. The media calls this a soft landing. History calls it a reset. We have now entered the final, most dangerous 15-year window before the dollar loses its reserve status entirely. The free lunch of the last half-century, where America prints paper in exchange for the world's real goods, is officially over. This is not speculation. This is an autopsy of the American financial empire and a precise timeline of the chaos that comes next. To understand why the collapse is inevitable, you first have to understand the machine that is breaking. For the last 50 years, the American economy hasn't run on productivity, manufacturing, or savings. It has run on a unique, engineered advantage that the French finance minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing bitterly called the exorbitant privilege. This privilege is not a vague diplomatic term. It is a specific economic mechanic that allowed the United States to operate under a different set of laws than every other nation on Earth. It starts with a concept called seigniorage. In simple terms, this is the profit made by a government when it issues currency. But for a global reserve currency, this profit is weaponized. Here is the transaction the world accepted for 5 decades. The United States prints paper. In exchange, China sends electronics, Germany sends cars, and Brazil sends coffee. We export inflation. They export real value. This is the ultimate economic weapon. It allowed the American government to run massive deficits without suffering the immediate hyperinflation that would destroy a country like Argentina or Turkey. But this system didn't happen by accident. It was built from the ashes of a crisis. In 1971, the first version of American dominance died. President Nixon ended the convertibility of the dollar to gold. The dollar was suddenly backed by nothing but faith. Trust evaporated. Inflation spiked. The system was moments away from total failure. To save it, Washington needed a new anchor. If the dollar couldn't be backed by gold, it had to be backed by the one commodity every single nation on Earth needed to survive: oil. This brings us to the Petrodollar Agreement of 1974. The deal was simple, ruthless, and brilliant. The United States guaranteed the security of the House of Saud. In return, Saudi Arabia agreed to price its oil exclusively in US dollars. This created what economists call structural demand. If Japan needed energy, it had to buy dollars first. If Italy needed heating oil, it had to buy dollars first. This meant that every central bank in the world was forced to hold vast reserves of US currency, regardless of what they thought of American policy. It created a permanent, artificial bid for the dollar. It didn't matter if the US economy was weak. It didn't matter if the government spent recklessly. The world had to buy our money to keep their lights on. This structural demand unlocked the third pillar of dominance: cheap borrowing. Because the world was swimming in dollars they needed for oil, they had to park that money somewhere safe. They bought US Treasury bonds. This allowed the US government to borrow trillions of dollars at interest rates far lower than economic fundamentals justified. We could fight wars in the Middle East, fund social programs, and bail out banks, all funded by the savings of developing nations. We printed money, and the inflation was diluted across the entire globe because everyone held our currency. Your inflation became the world's problem. For 50 years, this felt like a law of physics. It created an illusion of permanence. American politicians and voters began to believe that this was normal, that we were simply too big to fail. But the petrodollar was never an economic reality. It was a political agreement. It relied entirely on the diplomatic alignment between Washington and Riyadh. It relied on the world having no other option. The Portuguese thought their spice monopoly was permanent in the 1500s. The Dutch thought their banking system was untouchable in the 1700s. The British thought their empire was eternal in the 1900s. They were all wrong. The architecture of American dominance was built on a specific set of conditions that existed in 1974, but those conditions have eroded. The free lunch depended on a monopoly that no longer exists, and when a system built on artificial demand faces natural competition, it doesn't just decline, it collapses. To understand when that happens, we have to look at the timeline. Because the clock isn't random, it follows a cycle that is repeated 3 times in the last 500 years. Here's the variable that Wall Street models refuse to account for: time. Reserve currency status is not a permanent title, it is a life cycle, and like every biological or political life cycle in history, it has a distinct measurable lifespan. Historical data shows this cycle typically lasts between 80 to 110 years. The currency rises, it dominates, it overextends, competitors emerge, compartments cracks, and finally replacement happens. We have seen this exact pattern play out 3 times in the last 500 years. Every single time, the dominant power refused to believe its currency could fall. They thought they were different. They thought their system was too big to fail. They were wrong. All of them. Consider the Dutch guilder in the 17th century. The Dutch Republic had the most efficient economy in Europe, and Amsterdam was the undisputed trading capital of the world. The Dutch East India Company was the richest corporation in history, worth 7.9 trillion in modern terms. The guilder became the reserve currency because Dutch financial markets were the most sophisticated and trusted. But at the height of their power, they overextended. They fought multiple wars with England and France that they couldn't afford. By 1700, the Dutch were spending more on defense than they earned from trade. But the collapse wasn't instant. It was a slow bleed. The guilder remained the reserve currency for decades, purely through inertia. But then came the crisis point. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War in 1780 destroyed their trade dominance, and by 1815, the guilder had fallen from 40% of European reserves to less than 10%. It went from the world standard to irrelevance in a single generation. The cycle reset. The British pound took the throne. After defeating Napoleon in 1815, Britain became the global superpower. The gold standard, established by Britain, made pounds as good as gold. By 1900, 60% of international trade was invoiced in sterling. But the pattern is inescapable. Britain overextended. They fought the Boer War, which cost 10% of their GDP. Then came World War I, which devastated British finances and forced them to borrow $1.2 billion from America. Watch the timeline closely. By 1914, Britain was a net debtor. The pound remained the reserve currency, but the dollar was rising. It took another global crisis, World War II, to finally shatter the illusion. By 1945, Britain was bankrupt, owing $30 billion, 3 times its GDP. The transition from as good as gold to secondary currency took exactly 30 years. Now overlay the American timeline. Stage 1. Dominate. Established in 1944 at Bretton Woods, where the dollar was pegged to gold and America held 50% of global GDP. Stage 2. Overextension. From Vietnam to Afghanistan, America fought wars on credit. By 2008, the U.S. debt hit $10 trillion, but the dollar remained dominant because there were no alternatives. Stage 3. Competitors emerge. Just as the Dutch faced the English and the British faced the Americans, we now face the yuan, the euro, and decentralized cryptocurrencies. We are not approaching the cycle. We are deep inside it. The dollar is currently in stage 6 of 8. Alternatives are gaining critical mass. The petrodollar is cracking. BRICS nations are building parallel systems. The timeline, based on these historical patterns, indicates we have 10 to 15 years before the dollar loses its reserve status entirely. This doesn't mean the dollar disappears. The guilder didn't disappear, the pound didn't disappear, but they lost the privilege that kept their economies artificially wealthy. The denial phase is over. The mathematical cycle is entering its most volatile quadrant. But the catalyst that pushed us from decline to collapse isn't just time, it's a specific, suicidal mistake the US government made in 2022. History will record that the American empire did not die of natural causes. It committed suicide. While the cyclical timeline we just examined suggests a slow, natural decline, the United States government chose to accelerate the process by decades. They did this by violating the single most important rule of banking, neutrality. For a currency to be the global reserve, it must be apolitical. It must be a store of value that is safe for everyone, friend or foe. If you deposit money in a bank, you expect to be able to withdraw it, even if the bank manager disagrees with your politics. But in the last 10 years, Washington decided to turn the dollar from a neutral utility into a geopolitical weapon. This is stage 4 of the collapse pattern. The first warning shot was fired in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea. The US imposed sanctions that excluded Russia from certain dollar transactions. Moscow got the message immediately. They understood that holding US debt was a liability, not an asset. Over the next few years, Russia systematically dumped nearly all of its US treasuries, reducing holdings from $130 billion to near zero, and replaced them with gold. But Washington didn't learn. They escalated. On February 26, 2022, following the invasion of Ukraine, the United States and its allies detonated the nuclear option. They froze $300 billion of Russia's central bank reserves held overseas. Let that sink in. The US government simply deleted the savings of a sovereign nation because they disagreed with its military actions. Whatever you think of the war in Ukraine is irrelevant to the economics. From a financial perspective, this was a breach of contract. It sent a terrifying signal to every other nation on earth. Your money is not yours, it is ours, and we are merely letting you hold it until you disobey us. This was the moment the music stopped. The weaponization was intended to cripple Russia. Instead, it convinced the rest of the world that the dollar was unsafe. China looked at the $300 billion seizure and did the math. They hold nearly $1 trillion in US assets. They realized that in the event of a conflict over Taiwan, their wealth could be erased with a single keystroke. Saudi Arabia realized that if they disagreed with US policy in the Middle East, their oil revenues could be frozen. This triggered panic diversification. This is stage 5, confidence cracks. The weaponization convinced the entire non-Western world that they needed an alternative immediately. The data proves the panic is real. Following the 2022 sanctions, global central banks bought gold at the fastest pace since the 1970s. They bought over 1,000 tons of gold annually in 2022 and 2023. Why gold? Because gold has no counterparty risk. You cannot freeze gold that sits in a vault in Shanghai or Mumbai. You cannot sanction a physical element. This is the sound of the world's governments voting with their wallets. They are dumping the digital, weaponized dollar for the only asset that Washington cannot control. The US government believed it could use the dollar to force complaint instead. They forced competition. They incentivized their enemies and their allies to build a system that bypasses New York entirely. By freezing those reserves, America traded 50 years of future financial dominance for a momentary tactical strike. It was a strategic error of historic proportions, and because of that error, we have now crossed the event horizon. The alternatives are no longer just theories discussed in academic papers. They are being built, tested, and deployed right now. The network effect is flipped. We are now witnessing the most dangerous phase of the collapse pattern, stage 6. This is the moment where critical mass is reached, and the network effects that once protected the dollar begin to devour it. For decades, the dollar's greatest strength was simply that everyone else used it. It was the universal language of commerce. If a Peruvian coffee grower wanted to sell to a Vietnamese cafe, they transacted in dollars, because it was the only common ground. This network effect created a gravitational pull that kept the system intact, even when the fundamentals were rotting. But gravity has reversed. We are seeing the emergence of a parallel financial operating system, and unlike previous transitions which took decades to build, this infrastructure is being deployed at digital speed. The numbers do not lie, but they are being ignored by the mainstream press. Look at the metric of death for any reserve currency, the share of global trade invoiced in that currency. In 2022, the dollar accounted for 73% of international trade settlements. By 2024, that number had collapsed to 58%. That is a 15 percentage point drop in just 2 years. To put that in perspective, the dollar's decline over the previous 20 years was measured in fractions of a percent. We just witnessed 2 decades of erosion happen in 24 months. This is not a gradual shift, it is a landslide. Merchants are choosing non-dollar currencies because their trading partners are finally accepting them. The monopoly is over. The plumbing of the new world is already running. China's cross-border interbank payment system, known as CEPS, was dismissed as a joke when it launched in 2015. Western analysts laughed at it. They aren't laughing anymore. In 2060, they promised $27 trillion in transactions. That volume more than doubled in just 3 years. This system allows nations to trade oil, food, and technology without ever touching the US banking system, effectively making them immune to American sanctions. Simultaneously, the geopolitical map is being redrawn. The expansion of the BRICS alliance to include major energy producers like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iran is not a social club. It is an economic fortress. These nations control the majority of the world's oil supply. When they decide to bypass the dollar collectively, the petrodollar doesn't just die, it is buried. This brings us to the most terrifying variable in the modern equation, velocity. In previous centuries, currency transitions were slow because the physical movement of wealth was slow. In 1914, if Britain lost credibility, moving gold reserves to New York took weeks of logistical planning involving ships and railroads. It gave policymakers time to react. It gave the system time to stabilize. Today, moving billions in reserves takes seconds. We live in the age of the digital bank run. When confidence breaks, capital does not walk away. It evaporates instantly. We saw a preview of this with Silicon Valley Bank, with $42 billion fled in a single day. Now, imagine that scale applied to the US Treasury market. Technology is the accelerant that makes the historical 30-year transition timeline obsolete. The new timeline is 10 to 15 years. Digital currencies and blockchain technology allow countries to settle trades directly, peer-to-peer, without a global reserve intermediary. Project and Bridge is already testing this at the central bank level. They are building a highway that goes around the US toll booth. The alternatives are ready. They don't need to be invented, they just need to be switched on. And as the US continues to weaponize the old system, the rest of the world is racing to flip the switch. We are watching the end of an era in real time. Stage 6 is the point of no return. The network effects have flipped. It is now riskier for a developing nation to rely solely on the dollar than to diversify away from it. Once that psychological barrier is broken, the slide into Stage 7 crisis acceleration is inevitable, and when that crisis hits, the impact will not be felt in diplomatic cables or central bank spreadsheets. It will be felt in your supermarket, your gas station, and your retirement account, because when the dollar loses crown, the American people lose their shield. Up until this point, we have discussed the collapse of the dollar as a geopolitical event, something that happens in boardrooms in Shanghai or palaces in Riyadh. But the tragedy of Stage 6 is that the pain is not felt by the elites who broke the system. It is felt by you. When a reserve currency dies, the exorbitant privilege transforms into an exorbitant burden. For 50 years, the American middle class has enjoyed a lifestyle subsidized by the rest of the world. We have consumed more than we produced because we could print money to pay the difference. That era is over. When the structural demand for dollars evaporates, the artificial discount on the American way of life disappears. The first impact will be a permanent reduction in your standard of living. Currently, the United States runs an $800 billion annual trade deficit. We import real goods, cars, electronics, clothes, and send back paper. When the dollar loses its reserve status, foreign nations will no longer accept that paper at face value. To buy the same goods, America will have to export more or consume less. This implies a massive upward repricing of everything you buy. Estimates suggest a 20 to 30% decline in American living standards over the next decade as this adjustment takes place. This isn't just inflation where prices rise by 3%. This is a structural devaluation where your labor buys significantly less of the world's output. Then there is the trap of the $36 trillion debt. Right now, foreigners hold about $13 trillion of U.S. treasuries. They buy our debt to hold as reserves, but as we enter Stage 7 crisis acceleration, they will stop buying. In fact, they will start selling. When the foreign buyers leave, who funds the U.S. government's deficit? Who pays for the military, Social Security, and Medicare? There are only two options, and both are catastrophic. Option 1, the government raises taxes dramatically and cuts spending, triggering a Great Depression-style collapse. Option 2, the far more likely path, is that the Federal Reserve prints the difference. This leads to the nominal trap, and this is where most investors will get slaughtered. The government will likely choose to print money to buy its own bonds. This will keep the nominal value of your stocks and your house high. The numbers in your 401k might even go up. You will feel rich, but the real purchasing power of those dollars will collapse. A 30 to 50% devaluation of the currency means that a $1 million retirement portfolio will only buy $500,000 worth of goods and services in today's terms. You are not losing your money, you are losing your buying power. The number stays the same, the value evaporates. This is how empires default on their citizens without ever technically declaring bankruptcy. We are staring down the barrel of the largest wealth transfer in human history. Trillions of dollars in value are about to shift from those who hold paper assets, savings accounts, bonds, annuities, to those who hold real assets. It is a transfer from the dollar-dependent West to the commodity-rich East in the BRICS nations. The winners will be those who hold gold, which has historically surged 20-fold during previous currency collapses. The winners will be those who own productive land and businesses with pricing power. The losers will be the bondholders, the savers, the people who believed the system was permanent. The tragedy is not that this is happening. The tragedy is that it is mathematical, historical, and inevitable, yet almost no one is positioning themselves for it. America is more indebted than Portugal, the Netherlands, or Britain ever were at their peaks. The adjustment will not be gentle. It will be rapid, chaotic, and unforgiving. Stage 6 is ending. The timeline suggests we have entered the final transition. The question is no longer if the dollar dies. The question is, what are you holding when the music stops? The 8-stage reserve currency collapse pattern has destroyed 3 currencies in the last 500 years. It does not care about American exceptionalism. It is a cycle, and every cycle ends. The timeline is clear. 2025 to 2030 is the transition phase. Now, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And right now we are rhyming with the collapse of Portugal in 1640, the Netherlands in 1800, and Britain in 1945. The petrodollar monopoly is dead. The post-American financial era has already begun. The only variable left is how fast the remaining dominoes fall. Do not expect the government to save you. They are the ones who broke the system. This channel documents the autopsy of the dollar. I will track every stage of this collapse, every BRICS development, and every signal that the final crisis is approaching. Watch closely. The window to position yourself is closing.